Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is February the 16th, Monday, 2026. The time is 1 p.m., and I am in Miami-Dade County, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection Part 10, Political Contrivances. And I'll let you know, ladies and gentlemen, that I tend to do these lectures outdoors, and I may have to raise or project my voice from time to time in order to drown out the background noise. Please adjust your volumes accordingly, and thank you for tuning in. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin this lecture, as I have so many others, in addressing separate matters. The matter that I would like to address is the systematic slop that I've been seeing, particularly over the last 30 days, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, you would not believe how sloppy and inefficient my gang stalking campaign has become, ladies and gentlemen, since starting the EIS Media Group lecture series. Okay, my stalkers, undercovers, liaisons are falling apart. They are fleeing in 10 separate ways. They are retreating. They are backsliding. They are indeed regressing back to an ape-like state, ladies and gentlemen. And when I say ape-like state, I am talking the original ancestors of humankind, ladies and gentlemen. I do not care if you are Caucasian. I do not care if you are Latino, Black, Asian, Arab, Jewish, or Polynesian, or any derivative racial or ethnic group. Science, your DNA, your genetic makeup says that you are an ape. A great ape that has higher intelligence than the kind of ape that you see in your local zoo. Ladies and gentlemen, my gang stalkers have regressed from a Homo sapien state to an ape-like state. Ladies and gentlemen, they have regressed back to their Neanderthal state. Ladies and gentlemen, they are talking, walking apes. Ladies and gentlemen, and they are still perpetrating their neo-fascist thuggery on me, your host, obviously with impunity, but not with absolutely no consequences, because I'm reporting what they do to you, to me, to us, to all the people of all the countries in the entire world. All right, anywhere in the world that has this 2-bit silliness, ladies and gentlemen, silliness. I mean, I have literally run out of adjectives to describe clandestine gang stalking. We're just going to call it silliness, okay? And what makes it silly, ladies and gentlemen, is that the people who decided to participate in it thought that they were going to win something. I mean, I'm trying to figure this out, gang stalkers. What did the undercover operatives and the liaisons that recruited you into this promise you as a reward? Did they pull one of you to the side and say, "Hey there, buddy, you really want to impress your wife and kids? I got a signaling mechanism for you. Take the family out on a nice outing one day, maybe next week. You take them out on a nice Sunday afternoon, take them to the mall or take them to the park or take them to a museum or movie, somewhere there's going to be a lot of people. I got a signaling mechanism you can use in front of your wife and kids that'll make you look like a real big shot. And we'll find a predetermined target for you to use it on. He won't try nothing, that I can promise you. What do you say? Well, I would like to impress the family. Sometimes I think they don't appreciate me anymore. Yeah, I'll do it. Right? And then you go out in public and act like a jackass in front of your kids and wife. Everyone standing around you looking at you in horror and amazement at the degraded human shell of a person that has manifested right before their very eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about political matters today. Political matters that are directly tied to the national security of the greater world. And how it relates, ladies and gentlemen, to clandestine gang stalking. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part 10 of Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection. This lecture is subtitled Political Contrivances. And we're going to try something a little different today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to read from a transcript that was prepared by the United States Department of State, the Bureau of Public Affairs, Washington, D.C. This is the text of a research paper presented to this subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by the Department of State. This item has a date of December 14th, 1981, and is titled Cuba's Renewed Support for Violence in Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read this entire document. It is 12 pages long. Word for word, I'm going to read this, and we are going to do a summarized breakdown of each section, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to let you know, ladies and gentlemen, that this particular socio-political matter concerning Cuba is of particular importance to me, ladies and gentlemen, because Cuba is only about 88 miles away from Miami-Dade County. And you know, it's never a knock on communism. Okay, I've studied Marxist philosophy. I've studied Leninist philosophy. I've studied the communistic political trajectory, particularly from the early 1900s to today's date. Okay, I got no problem with China, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful country, beautiful history. Okay, a phenomenal economic system, thriving country. All right, a population of 2.4 billion people in that country. They've mastered the communist philosophy in China. They've done the same in North Korea. They've done the same in Iran. They've done the same in Russia. Venezuela has done well with communism as well. And Cuba is still... Cuba is still picking up the pieces from the Cuban Missile Crisis, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, there are people in this country, okay, that remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? when it was alleged that the Soviet Union was going to use Cuba as a launch pad for missiles or other nuclear materials aimed at the United States. I mean, there are so many people in this country that still remember those days. You know, I mean, in those days, Cuba was synonymous with terrorism. But fast forward about 35 years, 40 years, right? We have the Elian Gonzalez matter, where little Elian Gonzalez had his door kicked in by the feds, armed with AR-15s, and they dragged Elian Gonzalez out of his house by his collar and deported him back to Cuba. Okay, little 5-year-old kid. That captured the minds and hearts of every American. Every American was looking at the tabloids. Oh my God, did you see what happened to little Elian Gonzalez? How those horrible monsters kicked his door in and dragged him back off to Cuba because he and his parents and his whole family were here illegally? Can you believe those animals, those monsters? How dare they drag little Elian Gonzalez back to Cuba? Right? I was a 16-year-old kid. I remember watching The Political Matter, and I just remember thinking to myself, what's the big deal? It was obviously a precautionary measure. Okay, it is not a secret that Cuba has dabbled in and sponsored terrorism. So if you have Cuban persons from that country here in South Florida or anywhere in the country and they're not here legally, all right, the feds, the FBI, border security, whoever has the right to have guns on them when executing a deportation warrant. Okay, they didn't know if little Elian Gonzalez had a few cousins in the house armed with dynamite and pistols, ready to kill any Border Patrol agent that kicked the door in. We don't know that. Those Border Patrol people did not harm that child. Yeah, he got scared, but he was brought here illegally. No, it wasn't his fault. He didn't swim from Cuba to here. He's not the one who drove the boat. He was brought here. But, ladies and gentlemen, that sort of gave the collective American conscious, the collective American consciousness, some sympathy for the Cuban plight, some sympathy for the Hispanic plight, sympathy for the Mexican plight, sympathy for immigration, sympathy for persons who are here illegally looking for a better life, looking for a better future, dreamers as they call them. Okay, people who have come here from another country without documentation, who have settled here illegally, who want to provide a better life for them and their families at the expense of the American taxpayer. Okay, that's what it's called. But dreamer is a more politically correct term for that type of immigrant, ladies and gentlemen. It's just this simple. The more illegal immigrants you have in your country, the higher your taxes are going to be. All right, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the mechanisms behind that. I talked about that some in my previous Cuba lecture. But ladies and gentlemen, illegal immigration costs money. It costs the taxpayer money. The government's not paying for them. You are. Okay? So, I mean, I think that there was a measure of sympathy for the plight of illegal persons here in the United States, particularly from Spanish-speaking countries. But I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, having been a resident of Miami-Dade County for 8 years, knowing what I know now about various diasporas throughout this country from various other countries, particularly the undocumented sort, you have no idea what this country is in for, ladies and gentlemen. This is no joke. This is not a game. Okay, there are literal narco-terrorists riding around in Miami-Dade County right now from foreign countries, riding around with M16 assault rifles in the trunk, ladies and gentlemen, hand grenades in the trunk, Molotov cocktails in the trunk, biological weapons in the trunk. AK-47s in the trunk, ladies and gentlemen. Bushmaster 22 caliber assault rifles in the trunk of the car. Riding from point A to point B in a brand new sparkling BMW with military grade assault weapons in the trunk. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not a game. Narco-terrorism is alive and well, and it is here, right here in Miami-Dade County, Florida, ladies and gentlemen. It's not about what's happening this very second. We need to understand the history of U.S. relations with Cuba. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a realist. Okay? I know that China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, various communist countries throughout the world want Cuba to succeed because Cuba is also a communist country and they share the political ideals of various other communist countries. And I don't fault other communist countries for wanting Cuba to succeed. That is very generous of them. That is very benevolent of them. Okay? My issue is this. You know, there's an old saying that is old as time immemorial, right? And the saying goes like this: when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Okay? It essentially means this, ladies and gentlemen. That saying means this: when you go to a foreign place, adapt. Adapt, blend in, and become part of the culture, become part of the society there. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is South Florida. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is Miami-Dade County, Florida. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is a part of the world, a part of the country that is predominantly Cuban. I think 60% is the number. But this is still the United States. Where else, and this is my advice to Cuban Americans across this state: when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Okay? Where else in the United States do you see drive-by biological attacks? If you don't see it anywhere else in the country, why are you doing it in South Florida? Another thing, where else in the country do you see drive-by pellet gun attacks? If you don't see it nowhere else in the country, don't do it here in South Florida. Likely, where else in the country do you see drive-by rock gun attacks? If you don't see it anywhere else in the country, don't do it here in South Florida. Similarly, where else in the country do you see random acts of violence committed on motor scooters and electronic bikes? If you don't see it done anywhere else in the country, don't do it here. Okay? I am seeing all kinds of thuggery happening down here. It's obviously cartel activity, and everything that I have just described for you, ladies and gentlemen, happens here in Miami-Dade County every single day. All right, drive-by shootings, and I mean, what is this, 1992? Who does a drive-by shooting? They're happening on a daily basis right here in Miami-Dade County, ladies and gentlemen, and I hate to say this, But the overwhelming vast majority of these crimes are being committed by Cuban Americans. And I'm seeing them with my own eyes. Okay? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. If this kind of activity is not happening anywhere else in the country, don't do it here in South Florida just because it's very close to your homeland. Okay, I think some of the population here is too comfortable here because the United States federal government has been very kind to Cuban Americans, which is fine. Okay, you want to be a compassionate nation, you want to be a kind and caring nation, fine. You want to allow people here across the borders with no documentation and house them and give them amnesty at the expense of the taxpayer, fine. Go ahead. Do what thou wilt. Okay? Because, quite frankly, you ain't listening to the American people on this. You're not investing taxpayer dollars to secure the border in this, so fine. Do what you need to do to be compassionate. But when persons who are rather derived from other countries come here and they start committing acts of violence against people, you need to step up to the plate and uphold the U.S. Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen. Okay? You would be surprised at some of the thuggery I'm seeing down here, and it's not just violent crimes. It's gang stalking. It's organized pestering along with it. And I think that I, as a U.S. citizen, deserve better than that. I think you, as a United States citizen, deserve better than that. I think all U.S. citizens deserve better than that. And you know what? I think it's rather gelatin of the national security and intelligence apparatus of this country to allow the kinds of violent thuggery that goes on down here. You've taken a hands-off approach. Because you don't want the people to feel discriminated against. Okay. But what about sovereign United States citizens that have to shoulder that burden? You see? I remember back in the early to mid 2000s, I actually had sympathy for illegal immigrants. I wasn't going to say I was their supporter or anything like that, but I had sympathy for them because I had heard horrible things about some of what was going on in Mexico and in Cuba and other Latino countries, and I thought, well, they're taking a risk to get across the border and make a better life for themselves. But see, in my life, I had only probably met in my entire life up to that point. I was 22 years old. I had probably only met up to that point in my life maybe 3 or 4 Hispanic people ever. So I didn't really know the culture and the diaspora and just the general attitude that they have towards American citizens that are not Spanish speaking. But having lived in Miami-Dade County for 8 years, and mind you, ladies and gentlemen, I can live wherever I want. Okay, whether or not I get along with the majority population is irrelevant. I have the ability to live wherever I want to live in this country, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, it's called having sovereignty. And I need to be here right now because it allows me a consistent domain to do outdoor lectures, you see. So I'm just going to say this, ladies and gentlemen. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Okay, it's fine. If you're first generation, second generation, or third generation Cuban American, congratulations. Okay, I'm sure you want to contribute to society in the best way you can. Just understand, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Blacks have been in this country for 600 years. Okay, white Caucasian people have been in this country for 600 years roughly as well.
Asian Americans, some of the first Asian Americans came to this country in the 1920s.
That gives them about 105 years. So here's what I'm getting at with this. Okay? Historically, there are other demographics that have been in this country and have seniority over the fresh diaspora of illegal immigrants that we've seen from Spanish-speaking countries. If you're from a Spanish-speaking country and you're first, second, or third generation, that gives you up to about 50 years of history in this country. Okay? If you are plotting to uproot, subvert, or harm people who come from 100 years, 500 years, 600 years of history in this country, that is not being a model minority. Okay? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. That's all I'm saying. Okay? If you want to see some of, ladies and gentlemen, some of the instances of violence that I've had perpetrated against my person by the majority demographic here, I invite you to do a public records request for Miami-Dade Police. Do public records requests for Broward County Sheriff. Do public records requests for Fort Lauderdale Police. Do public records requests for any number of police departments in the said areas. You will see police reports by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith having experienced horrible crimes of unadulterated and violent thuggery committed against me by the majority population here in South Florida. People who don't even understand a thing that comes out of my mouth, who drive past me on an electric scooter and sling a biohazardous chemical in my face and keep going, scurrying right off. Ladies and gentlemen, okay, this is cartel activity we're talking about here. And this lecture here is going to get to the root of some of that cartel activity that I see here every day. All right, I think it's a shame that a country that calls itself a democracy, a constitutional republic, and the freest country in the world can't get one of its states under control with respect to a foreign-speaking population that resides there. You have any idea the kinds of thuggery that's happening here? All right. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. You're going to hear about the origins of the kinds of political, sociological, and historical events that led to the current state of events in South Florida, ladies and gentlemen. This is important stuff. All right, so we are going to begin with the preface. Any formulation of U.S. foreign policy for Latin America and the Caribbean would be incomplete without in-depth analysis of Cuba's role in the region. Some of Cuba's international activities have received publicity and attention, but much has been taking place out of the public view. While understanding the full range of Cuba's activities abroad is obviously essential for governments engaged in foreign policy planning, the general public is often uninformed about the nature and extent of Cuba's involvement in other countries. This study of Cuban activities in Latin America and the Caribbean is being issued in the interest of contributing to better public understanding of U.S. foreign policy and developments in the region. The focus of this study is Cuba's activities in the Americas. It does not attempt to give a description of conditions in the countries in which Cuba is active or to analyze why violent groups develop, but instead examines the degree to which Cuba is directly engaged in efforts to destabilize its neighbors by promoting armed opposition movements. Cuba is clearly not the sole source of violence and instability in the region, but Cuban activities militarize and internationalize what would otherwise be local conflicts. In a region whose primary needs are for economic development, social equity, and greater democracy, Cuba is compounding existing problems by encouraging armed insurrection, ladies and gentlemen. This report describes Cuban activities that are either publicly known or can be revealed without jeopardizing intelligence sources and methods. Cuban involvement is not limited to the examples contained in this study, ladies and gentlemen. So essentially, this document has contents of a preface, a summary, policies, methods, case studies. Okay, Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, the Caribbean, Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, Dominican Republic, South America, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and then a postscript. So that's the makeup of this 12-page document. Ladies and gentlemen, what's going to stand out to you about this lecture is the blunt nature of it. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not here to hide what I've experienced here as an American citizen among other American citizens who have a very difficult language barrier to overcome. Ladies and gentlemen, it's one thing to simply not understand what someone else is saying because of their language. That's perfectly fine. Some people like listening to various languages just to hear them. You don't understand what's being said, but you enjoy the way the language sounds, right? That's why some people visit other countries. Some people might go to France or Germany or Russia, Sweden, China, Mongolia, Japan. Perhaps you've gone to the Arab countries, like, for example, Egypt or Iraq, or perhaps you've taken a tour to Iran or Pakistan or Afghanistan. Or maybe you visited Sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe you visited Nigeria or Uganda or Tanzania. Or maybe you've decided to go to a country like Italy or Belgium or Romania. Or perhaps you've decided to visit one of the Hispanic countries like, for example, Paraguay, Uruguay, perhaps Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, just to hear what foreign languages sound like among the natives. Okay, it can be quite invigorating hearing people who speak a different language than yourself speak among themselves. Just observing the mannerisms and the language and the culture there. It can be very fascinating. So, that can always be enjoyable, but when you move to a part of the country that you were born in, and the minute you get here, you're butting heads with people who speak a language that you simply just don't speak. Well, that's a cause for concern, ladies and gentlemen. Because quite frankly, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence gives us some semblance of what it means to have a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. It doesn't specify a demographic. It doesn't say this is a country of white people, by white people, for white people, or of black people, for black people, etc., etc. Or this is a country of Hispanics, by Hispanics, or for Hispanics, or any of the demographics. It doesn't specify, okay? The founding documents of this country doesn't specify which people, of the people, by the people, and for the people is for. So one might reasonably conclude that statement means the entire United States populace, and not any specific segment of the United States populace, but the entire United States populace. You see, and that includes anyone that lives here in a permanent resident capacity, or maybe they've got work visas, or perhaps they're looking at a path towards immigration. Maybe they're working with immigration officers. Okay, I don't fault that. But why do we have narco-terrorists here in South Florida that are speaking in a language that most of the rest of America can't understand? America has a right to know what's going on in Miami-Dade County, and we're going to give them some semblance of that right here and now, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, now I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen. I don't have a ton of Hispanic friends. Okay, there's probably not two people here in Miami-Dade County that would raise their hand and say, hey, I'm this guy's best bud. All right, Cuban Americans like homogenous communities. They like homogenous malls. They like homogenous neighborhoods. They like homogenous grocery stores. They like homogenous retail stores. They like homogenous barber shops. They like homogenous parks and recreational facilities. They like homogenous museums. They like homogenous tourist attractions. They like homogenous beaches. They like homogenous shopping centers. Okay, they like for everything to be exclusively for that demographic. And if people from other demographics intermingle or attempt to even just observe, they're oftentimes treated with horrible hostility here. Horrible hostility. Horrible hostility. Sometimes even with narco-terrorist violence. And disease and biological attacks and things like that. But ladies and gentlemen, I digress. Let's get back to the main talking points of this lecture. The preface basically said that the Cuban state is very deleterious, and it is it poses a threat to not only the United States but to other countries as well, because it is advocating and advancing the interests of violent extremism in other countries, not just in Cuba, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'd like to say going forward is this. All are welcome to the EIS Media Group lecture series. It doesn't matter what your demographic background is or what language you speak. I'm talking from experience. I'm talking from my own political philosophy. And I'm talking from the posture of a targeted individual who has experienced quite a bit of clandestine gang stalking here in Miami-Dade County at the hand of a number of demographics. It isn't just Cubans. I've experienced it at the hands of Haitians and Jamaicans as well. Okay, I've experienced it at the hands of Black Americans and Caucasians as well. Okay, Guatemalans, Mexicans, El Salvadorians, Argentinians, Puerto Ricans as well. Okay, I am not here to tiptoe around the tulips, as they say. Okay, we're tackling these matters head on. Okay, and I hope that Cuba prospers. I hope that it does well. I hope that it comes to some agreement with the United States at some point. I hope the Cuban Americans assimilate here well. I hope they do well. I hope they find a way to forge a future, a path for them. I hope they learn to adapt better when people who are not Cuban come down here and decide to settle here or decide to tour here or observe the culture here. And I hope that America going forward is better because of its Cuban and Mexican and Jamaican or Haitian immigrants, and not worse off. That's my hope. But hope is sort of a component of faith. Okay? What you might say is I have faith that things will get better in the future, but I'm going to let you know something right now, ladies and gentlemen. If clandestine gang stalking doesn't clear up, all right, if the situation in Miami-Dade, Florida don't clear up, if the U.S. national security apparatus and the intelligence apparatus in this country doesn't put a halt to the narco-terrorism that's going on here in Miami-Dade County, then we're not going to see a better future for America, and Florida is going to turn into a war zone. You understand? There are variables to consider here. I want things to get better, but they're not going to get better if the narco-terrorism that goes on down here is not checked. All right. So we're going to look at the summary, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a country-by-country examination of Cuba's activities in Latin America and the Caribbean that makes clear that Cuba has renewed its campaign of the 1960s to promote armed insurgencies. In particular, Cuba has stepped up efforts to stimulate violence and destabilize its neighbors, turning away from its earlier policy of strengthening normal diplomatic relations in the hemisphere. Since 1978, Cuba has worked to unite traditionally splintered radical groups behind a commitment to armed struggle with Cuban advice and material assistance. Trained ideology committed cadres in urban and rural guerrilla warfare. Supplied or arranged for the supply of weapons to support the Cuban trained cadres' efforts to assume power by force. Encourage terrorism in the hope of provoking indiscriminate violence and repression in order to weaken government legitimacy and attract new converts to armed struggle, and use military aid and advisors to gain influence over guerrilla fronts and radical governments through armed pro-Cuban Marxists. So what we see there in the opening of the summary is this is not a birthday cake and ice cream organization we're talking about here. All right, these guys are doing weapons smuggling. They're doing armed insurgencies. They're embezzling taxpayer funds. Okay, they're skimming off the top of the treasury. All right, they are paying guerrilla terror. They are paying for the training and the armament of guerrilla terrorist groups. Okay, they are creating armed insurgencies. And these are not armed insurgencies of a political nature. They're just simply narco-terrorists. Okay, it's not so much like, for example, if you look at over the past 30 years, in the United States, when you hear the term insurgent, or if you hear the term terrorist, or if you hear the term militant, typically in American news stations, you see images of Al-Qaeda, of insurgents, or ISIS, or ISIL, or insurgents from the Middle East, right? These insurgents from the Middle East had political problems with the United States and Israel. Now, this was a matter of historical fact, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? They had political issues with the United States and Israel concerning land, the availability of land, the availability of resources, and the ability for these countries to live with sovereignty. Okay? Independent from Western influences. Now, there are some Americans that think that that ideology is evil. There are certain Americans that think that that ideology is the ideology of the people who hold it. Okay? Me personally, I've never visited the Middle East. I'd love to visit the Middle East. I mean, Israel, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Kuwait, Jordan, Syria. These are gorgeous, gorgeous countries that have steep and marvelous histories that go back several thousands of years. Okay? It would be a true honor and a privilege to visit some of these countries, right? And see their culture and their people, regardless of if it's a Hebrew country that adheres to Judaism or if it's an Arab country that adheres to Islam. Okay? We're talking about some of the most beautiful countries anywhere in the world, from the Middle East on over into Asia. Beautiful, gorgeous countries, right? The same in Northern and Western Europe, Eastern Europe, all over the world. We have beautiful countries. And I just hate, even Cuba. Cuba's a beautiful country. And I hate to see any country labeled by the United States as a terrorist country. I hate to see it. I hate to see any country in the world labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism. There is always there is always a story on the opposite side of the coin. We know what the United States says about these countries and why their investigations have led to a designation of a state sponsor of terrorism, but there's also an opposite side. I applauded Trump for visiting North Korea. I applauded Trump for strengthening diplomatic ties with China. I applauded Trump for attempting to establish better relationships with Russia. I think the United States has the capacity and the resources to make friends, or at least diplomatic allies with any country. But my special concern with Cuba is this. They're only about 97 miles away from the United States. So if they are participating in narco-terrorism and facilitating that here, that is a cause of concern for me, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, and I want to get to the root of why this is the case. Now, we're going to continue on in the same summary. Unlike Che Guevara's attempts during the 1960s, Cuba's subversion today is backed by an extensive secret intelligence and training apparatus, modern military forces, and a large and sophisticated propaganda network. Utilizing agents and contracts nurtured over more than 20 years, the Castro government is providing ideological and military training and material and propaganda support to numerous violent groups, often several in one country. Cuba is most active in Central America, where its immediate goals are to exploit and control the revolution in Nicaragua and to introduce the overthrow of the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala. At the same time, Cuba is working to destabilize governments elsewhere in the hemisphere. Cuba provides advice, safe haven, communications, training, and some financial support to several violent South American organizations. In the Caribbean, Cuban interference in the post-election period has been blunted in Jamaica, but Grenada has become a virtual Cuban client. Now, I want to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Cuban influences spread into Jamaica for a time, but it got stopped. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it goes without saying that Jamaica and Haiti also suffer some of the same socio-political ills that Cuba faces. Okay, I mean, machete attacks in Haiti, for example, are so frequent that if you go and visit Haiti on vacation, when you get off the airplane and you go into the airport, the staff in the airport give everybody that coming from another country a complimentary machete so you can protect yourself. Okay, I mean, it is the machete wielding capital of the free world, ladies and gentlemen, and Jamaica ain't far behind. All right, the Caribbean islands are a conflicted place. Okay, you know, it's a situation where you have Cuba, which is essentially a client state of China, Russia, Vietnam, Iran, North Korea, so many communist countries throughout the world. And then Jamaica is essentially a duchy of the United Kingdom. As are many kingdoms. I mean, keep in mind, Great Britain had the largest empire in the history of humankind at one point. Okay, the empire of Great Britain was at one point the most dominant empire that the world had ever seen. So even to this day, it has commonwealths and duchies under its political authority. Okay? And then when you look at Puerto Rico, well, that's been pretty much annexed by the United States. All right, so much so that they almost made it the 51st state. Almost made it the 51st state. They were debating it in Congress. They said, well, should we make Puerto Rico the 51st state or not? And eventually they just stopped talking about it. I don't even think they had a vote or a resolution on it. They got the whole country talking. They were even talking about it on the news at one point. Is Puerto Rico going to be the 51st state of the United States? That's all everybody was talking about. I still remember the debates. Then they just turned off the spigot. They just stopped it. They didn't even get into why. They just said, we're stopping this conversation right now. But the United States still has so much power over Puerto Rico, they might as well make it the 51st state. And then you got the Dominican Republic. All right, the prostitution capital of the Caribbean. So you got a whole row of islands. Each one of them is under the authority of a different entity. Cuba's under the authority of the Soviet Union and China, Iran and North Korea. Puerto Rico's under the authority of the United States. Jamaica's under the authority of England, and the Dominican Republic is under the authority of quite a few countries. We don't even, so many countries that we can't even name them all. You see, it's a very conflicted island strip, ladies and gentlemen. And then in the 1980s, when Fidel Castro said, you know what, we're going to dump all our felons into Miami so we can start a new a new domain for the Cuban people. The United States just said, fine, come on in, right? So here's what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to look into some more of these summaries. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, this document is 12 pages long. We're going to skip down just a little bit. We're going to go to Cuba's enormous investment of energy. Cuba's enormous investment of energy, money, and agents in this campaign would not be possible without Soviet help. Soviet assistance, now totaling over $8 million a day, enables Cuba to maintain the best equipped and largest per capita military forces in Latin America and to channel substantial resources abroad. In return, Cuba usually is careful not to jeopardize ongoing government relationships in Latin America important to the Soviet Union. Now, I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Like I say, okay, I am not going to sit here and fault Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, or any communist country in the world for trying to give Cuba a helping hand. I'm not going to do that because communist countries stick together just like capitalist countries stick together. Okay? But here's where the conflict comes in, right? So here in Miami-Dade County, I mean, you could look at me. I mean, you got people that look at me and say, well, he ain't Cuban, he ain't Jamaican, he ain't Haitian, he ain't Dominican, he ain't Mexican, Guatemalan, he ain't El Salvadorian, he ain't Russian, he ain't Asian, he ain't Chinese, he ain't Japanese, he ain't Paraguayan, he ain't Chilean, he ain't Peruvian, he ain't Panamanian, he ain't Puerto Rican, he ain't Dominicana. Okay, why is he here? Well, you know, first of all, read the Constitution and get back to me. That's what I'm going to start saying to persons that challenge my First Amendment right to free speech on these matters. Go read the Constitution, the full document, and then come back to me. And if you have any more questions, go read the Declaration of Independence, then go read the Bill of Rights. I am not going to sit here and babysit your emotions as to what I think is the right course of action for this country. I'm a sovereign United States citizen, and I reserve the right to comment on any socio-political matter that I choose to in any part of the country that I wish to dwell in. Go read the Constitution, go read the Bill of Rights, go read the Declaration of Independence, and then come talk to me, and then we'll have a discussion about it, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so it's going to give a breakdown as to Cuba's actions in various countries. It says here in Nicaragua, Cuba has quietly increased its presence to 5,000 personnel, including more than 1,500 security and military advisors. In El Salvador, Cuba's key role in arming the Salvadorian guerrillas was exposed, and Castro admitted supplying arms. In Costa Rica, Special Legislative Commission documented Cuba's role in establishing an arms supply network during the Nicaraguan Civil War, and found the network was later used to supply Salvadorian insurgents. In Colombia, Cuba was discovered to have trained guerrillas at an attempt to establish a people's army. So what we can see is that resources that have been made available to Cuba, probably by third parties. I mean, listen, I'm a realist. I know that during this time period in American history, the U.S. and the Soviet Union weren't getting along very well. As a matter of fact, the U.S. and the entire communist world were not getting along very well. So yeah, it's possible that these various countries combined their resources and their personnel, okay, to arm insurgent groups to protect them against potential meddlers, right? Including the United States. But here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. It's just narco-terrorism. It's just narco-terrorism. That's it. Okay? The jihadists and militants of the early 2000s had political problems with America. The insurgents that Cuba was arming, and still is to the present day, these guys, they don't have any political problems with the U.S. The only thing they care about is that they're allowed entry into this country. Okay? The entire scope of their weapons acquisition, their guerrilla warfare training, okay, any terrorist resources that are provided to them by the Cuban government, it's just to protect cocaine boats. That's it. There are no political problems with the United States. Like, you're not ever going to see Cubans hijack a plane and ram it into the side of a building. Okay, you're never going to see Cuban people coming over here doing suicide bombings. Okay, you're not going to see Cuban people coming over here with rocket launchers blowing up daycares or nothing. But they will take a rocket launcher and protect a shipment of heroin with it, right? Okay, they'll take a few M16s and some grenade launchers and protect a 10-ton cocaine shipment. All right, they'll take a squad of 1,500 guerrilla fighters, right? And put them on a coca leaf plantation with AK-47s to protect the coca leaves, which are needed to make cocaine. It's just narco-terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. And when they come to the United States with fake visas, they're setting up shop here to deal dope throughout the state of Florida. Okay, right? The U.S. federal establishment hasn't stopped it yet, and it's been going on for 75 years here. So it doesn't look like the U.S. federal establishment is going to stop it anytime soon. So, okay, fine. The United States says, come over here and deal as much cocaine as you want. As a matter of fact, bring it by the ton. Forget nickel and dime cocaine sales. We want you to bring over a 50-ton shipment of the purest cocaine you can find and just sell it on the street here in America. At least it generates wealth. That's been the U.S.'s attitude towards cocaine shipments for about 70 years now. So, okay, fine, go ahead, do it. You got narco-terrorists that are here saying, you know what? We got all this weaponry. We got all these explosives. We got all this cocaine. We got about 75 tons of it ready to sell it on the street at retail value. Right? Let's have a little fun. Right? We're here in Miami-Dade County. It's sunny. It's beautiful. It's America. Our people run the county. I mean, at least we're the most populous. Let's have a little fun while we're down here. Right? We got 75 tons of cocaine, 30 tons of heroin, and about 250,000 Quaalude pills that we're going to sell you. Miami-Dade County. Let's have a little fun while we do it. Right? Let's cruise around and do drive-by shootings against people that we think are unfit or unwelcome here in Miami-Dade County. Let's hook up with some local gang members and see if we can't get them hooked into some dope smuggling. Let's see if we can find industrious thinking Miamians and get them hooked into the arms trafficking trade that we are so ready for. All right, we're going to do a couple of armored truck heists while we're down here. Come on, y'all, let's have a little fun while we're here. We don't have to go back to Cuba for another 60 days. Let's have some fun. All right, let's start a brothel. All right, we'll sell prostitutes to tourists for $150 an hour. All right, 18 years old and over. That's the standard age for a prostitute here in Miami, 18 or over. Right, but I mean, if a couple 15-year-olds or 14-year-olds get snuck in there, well, so what? Nobody's asking any questions. Right? Get into some human smuggling, you know, maybe a little slavery while we're down here, you know? Maybe a little human trafficking, maybe a little child slavery while we're down here, ladies and gentlemen. Child workers, child cooks, child maids, child farm hands. Come on, y'all, let's have a little fun. Let's make some money while we're here and have a little fun doing it. Right? That's the narco-terrorist attitude. As soon as they touch base here, that's their attitude. All right. So we're going to read through this thing. All right, so we see here in part of the summary, it says Cuba is quick to exploit legitimate grievances for its own ends, but its strategy for an armed struggle is not based on appeals to the people. Instead, Cuba concentrates on developing self-proclaimed vanguards committed to violent action. Revolutions, according to this approach, are made by armed revolutionaries. Cuba's revolutionaries to train, equip, and advise those who opt for violent solutions imposes obstacles to economic progress, democratic development, and self-determination in countries faced with growing economic difficulties. The spiraling cycle of violence and counter-violence, which is central to Cuba's policy, only exacerbates the suffering of ordinary people and makes necessary adjustments more difficult. So I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Essentially, what it's saying is that the Cuban state is arming, equipping, and readying these narco-terrorists that are essentially what you might describe as armed bodyguards of the Cuban government. They're not really army personnel, although I wouldn't be surprised if the actual military of Cuba was assisting these narco terrorists in training duties. But their core function is to serve as bodyguards for Cuban elites and protectors of drug shipments. That's it. And anybody who messes with either is at risk of getting blown up by an RPG-7. Okay? And it's saying that the taxpayers are getting fleeced by the Cuban government so that it can take this money and arm these insurgents to protect these drug shipments which are being sold overseas. And a lot of the money from those drug shipments is coming right back to Cuba into the pockets of Cuban officials. Okay, if you remember my previous lecture, Cuba Part 9, okay, you will hear me read from a number of court cases and Senate testimonies that involved narco terrorists being tried for crimes here. And some of these guys were getting plea deals to testify against their bosses. Okay? And this is exactly what they were saying. They were saying that essentially these Cuban officials, which were actual elected officials of Cuba, and some of them were appointed politicians of Cuba, were actually overseeing and facilitating up to 31 tons of cocaine from brought over from Colombia to Cuba and from Cuba to the United States. And a lot of that money was going back into Cuban politicians' pockets when it was sold here in the States. It was being shipped back to Cuba and was being put in the pockets of Cuban politicians. That's what's being said here. Cuban taxpayer dollars were going into the cultivation of drugs and armed insurgent activity. And it was very expensive, and the quality of living for the Cuban people just went right down the toilet, ladies and gentlemen. That's why so many Cuban people came to the United States to seek a better life, but it just didn't pan out. Because there was a language barrier, there was a cultural barrier, there was the resentment barrier, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was only 20 years removed from these activities, ladies and gentlemen. We must understand that. All right, so we have, we're going to go into section 1. We're going to read a few paragraphs from each section to give you a general overview of what's being done. This first section is called policies. When it first came to power, the Castro regime had its own theory of how to spread revolution to reproduce elsewhere the rural-based guerrilla warfare experience of Castro's 26th of July movement in Cuba. In Che Guevara's words, the Andes would become the Sierra Maestra of South America. Initial attempts to repeat Cuba's revolution elsewhere failed decisively. During the late 1960s, the Castro regime gradually reined in its zealots. Without abandoning its ideology or its ties to radical states and movement, Cuba began to pursue normal government-to-government relations in the hemisphere. By the mid-1970s, Um, Cuba's isolation in the Americas eased and full diplomatic or consular relations were reestablished with a number of countries. Um, you'll see a number of references to Che Guevara in these um, in these documents. Um, for those of you who are not familiar with Che Guevara, Che Guevara is a legendary figure in Cuban history. There are quite a few pop cultural references to Che Guevara that you see in various, I guess you could call it artworks. And sometimes you see references to him in television shows, like I think that TV show The Simpsons, the animated television show The Simpsons had an episode where Lisa Simpson had a conversation with Che Guevara, or it might have been Fidel Castro. I mean, it's difficult to know. That episode is about 30 years old, but I mean, you see references to him in various murals. Like there are a lot of murals that reference Che Guevara. He's seen as kind of like a martyr of sorts in Cuban history. I mean, he's typically shown wearing one of those hats it's kind of like one of those hats that you see that was real popular in France. You know, like one of those mime hats. And smoking a cigar. He was born in Argentina, June 14th, 1928, and died in La Higuera, Bolivia, October 9th, 1967. He was a Marxist. I'm looking at his Wikipedia page right now. He was a Marxist, a physician, an author, a guerrilla leader, diplomat, politician, and military theorist. He was a major figure in the Cuban Revolution, and his stylized visage has become a countercultural symbol of rebellion and global insignia in popular culture. So this image of him that I'm looking at right now is probably the image that I'm referencing that you see in popular culture a lot. It's the guy looking up, and he's got on this hat that looks kind of like a painter's hat, and it's got an insignia on the front, and he's looking up, and he looks very determined. Mustache, beard, he has looked like a leather vest on. Hair's a little disheveled. I mean, he's rumored to have been this great military strategist and Marxist revolutionary. I mean, apparently he was the Minister of Industries of Cuba from 11th February 1961 to April 1st of 1965. He was the president of the National Bank of Cuba, which, I mean, it's an interesting designation for a guy that I'm not sure has any background in economics at all. But he was the president of the Bank of Cuba for some reason. From 26 November 1959 to 23rd of February 1961. A very accomplished man. I mean, whether or not you agree with what he did, which, me personally, I don't agree with anything that he did, but he was apparently a very involved figure in the developing Cuban state. He was executed October 9th, 1967 by firing squad. There was apparently the CIA officer involved. I mean, the CIA in these days was very involved in what you might describe as Caribbean affairs. I mean, he was just a guy that he died a horrible death. I mean, it's just, you know, we'll look at the Cuban Revolution that he was a part of. That was something him and Fidel Castro were apparently brothers in arms during the Cuban Revolution. I guess they wanted independence. All right, they did a lot of fighting around the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They got help from the urban guerrilla network of Frank Pais. All right, he was a part of a rebel army. And I'm curious as to, I need to look at this real quick. Okay, so what we have here is Che Guevara having fought against the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba as a key leader in Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement. So this was an anti-imperialist fight that he was waging. Apparently, him and Fidel Castro and other Marxist, Leninist fighters wanted to oppose the U.S.-backed dictatorship. I mean, they didn't want the U.S. involved in their affairs. And you know, this is a story that I've read at numerous points in times in the past. But having come across Che Guevara's name a number of times in the last couple of lectures, I think it's fit to talk about him to a degree here. He fought alongside Fidel Castro against the United States-backed dictatorship in Cuba. Okay, it was an anti-imperialist guerrilla fighting unit. Now let's keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen, okay? These are the types of historical narratives that need to be taken into consideration. All right, when you're talking about today's political landscape, okay? I mean, Che Guevara wanted an independent Cuba, but see, where Che Guevara messed up was he didn't realize the depth of his enemy. This man went on a suicide mission, right? Trying to free up Cuba from the United States influences. Now, don't get me wrong. His brother in arms, Fidel Castro, eventually became the ruler of Cuba, and quite frankly, didn't rule it any better than the United States did. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think the United States' dictatorship, the one that they ran, was any worse than what Fidel Castro did there. All Fidel Castro did was introduce the Cubans to narco-terrorism and increased cocaine trafficking. So, I mean, Che Guevara probably would have been better to have just maybe found a regular job, or maybe join the army or join the Cuban military. I think him resisting the way he did was futile. And I don't think what he did benefited anybody at all. Okay, because when Fidel Castro got in there, what did he do? He ran Cuba into the ground. And Che Guevara fought alongside Fidel Castro to make that catastrophe happen. You see what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, it's a romantic story, don't get me wrong. Some people say that Che Guevara is like the Cuban Jesus or something. He sacrificed his life so that the Cuban people could be better, right? That's fine. There's all kinds of narratives surrounding guys who have sacrificed themselves. Some people say Martin Luther King was the black Jesus. All right, society is for some reason always looking for that next guy to sacrifice himself for the people so that no progress whatsoever can be made. Okay, that's not why we're here today, ladies and gentlemen. We are here talking about clandestine gang stalking, the quintessential political problem of the 21st century. We are not talking about regime change. We aren't talking about getting rid of the president of the Congress. Okay, we're not talking about an armed insurgency. We're not talking about the Capitol riots. Okay, we're talking about exchange of ideas. We're talking about a forthright debate. We're talking about the limits of government reach into the lives of citizens. Okay, we're talking about of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay, we're talking about the tyranny of the proletariat. Okay, we're talking about fairness in taxation. We're talking about life, liberty, and happiness. We're talking about what it means to be a United States citizen in today's world. You know, life, liberty, and happiness is something that your host, E.I. Smith, is going to pursue because I have the inalienable right to pursue it. Okay? We're not talking about martyrs. Okay? We aren't talking about guys jumping in front of bullets for their cause. What's the point of doing that? If something happens to you, now you can't pursue your cause. You see? No, I don't think Che Guevara's story is romantic. No, I don't think Martin Luther King Jr.'s story is romantic. Quite frankly, having read the Bible a number of times, I'd have liked to see Christ Jesus himself do something a little different than allowing himself to get butchered. All right, we're talking about politics in the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're talking about the right for a person to get up every day and pursue life, liberty, and happiness. That's what we're talking about. Okay, we're not talking about what Benito Mussolini did when he armed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Italian peasants and stormed the capital of Rome, walked right up to King Victor Emmanuel III and said, "King, Your Highness, Your Royal Majesty, all right, King Emmanuel III, I would like for thee to make me Prime Minister." King Victor Emmanuel III made him Prime Minister right there on the spot. He had no choice. He could not go against the shock and awe that he just saw with this one man, Benito Mussolini, marching into Rome with thousands of peasants, all armed, ready to do war with the Italian army because they wanted change in Italy. Okay, this isn't about Adolf Hitler, what he did, trying to create a 1,000-year Reich, trying to invade all of Europe. We're not talking about that. We're talking about diplomacy. We're talking about the exchange of ideas. We are talking about the EIS Media Group lecture series, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're talking about positive change. All right, we're talking about a man, a sovereign citizen, me, your host, E.I. Smith, claiming my inalienable rights, securing my inalienable rights, fulfilling my obligation to live according to the Constitution of the United States. Okay, an obligation that I owe to myself and society. My inalienable rights facilitate that pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we're going to skip down a little bit. We're going to go to the part that says armed struggle. The new Cuban offensive relies heavily on violence. An outline Cuba's strategy is to unite traditionally splintered radical groups behind a commitment to armed struggle with a Cuban advice and material assistance, train ideologically committed cadres in urban and rural guerrilla warfare, supply or arrange for the supply of weapons to support the Cuban trained cadres' efforts to assume power by force. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's just narco-terrorism. That's all that this is. That's all this is. The armed struggle, the propaganda, all of it. It's about securing Castro's regime. It's about protecting Castro's regime from internal coup d'etat. Okay, it's about narco-terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. It's about protecting Castro, and it's about narco-terrorism. That's it. That's all this is about. Okay. Part 2, methods. We see sophisticated strategy, learning from Cueva's failure in Bolivia. Cuban doctrine now emphasizes the need to enlist support for armed struggle through advanced training of local guerrilla cadres, sustained aid and advice, extensive propaganda activities, the focal approach of the 1960s. When Cuba-sponsored teams in the field were considered enough to spark insurrection, they've given ways to a more sophisticated strategy involving extensive commitments and risks. It talks about Soviet support. I've talked about that briefly already. The Soviet Union was a major stabilizer for Cuba in the 1960s. It shared its communist ideology with Cuba, and it's helped stabilize it financially. This is an interesting footnote. It says here, according to World Bank, Cuba's per capita average growth, annual growth rate, averaged minus 1.2% from 1960 to 1978. Cuban economic performance ranked in the lowest 5% worldwide and was one of the worst of all socialist countries. Only massive infusions of Soviet aid have kept consumption levels from plummeting. Cuba today depends more heavily on sugar than before 1959. The industrial sector has been plagued by mismanagement, absenteeism, and serious shortages in capital goods and foreign exchange. The economic picture is so bleak that in 1979 and again in October of 81, the Cuban leadership had warned that 10 to 20 more years of sacrifice lies ahead. So, I mean, you just had a lot of financial mismanagement. There was very low growth, very low wages, very low entrepreneurship. All right, everything was nationalized, and jobs that paid more than the bare minimum for a person to get by week to week were offered. It was a period of transition for Cuba, no doubt. But one thing that I can say about the Cuban Americans here is that it does seem like there's a desire for the Cuban Americans here to find employment anywhere and everywhere possible. I think that's a good mentality to have. Okay, there's nothing wrong with being employed. Okay, if the wages are great, awesome. If the wages are meager, not so awesome, but it's a living, But it's obvious to me that with the onset of clandestine gang stalking, the reason you have so many people here employed is so they can monitor people and learn signals. Okay, it's not just about earning a living. It's about monitoring people. Okay, I could get a job as a FedEx driver so I can see how gang stalkers maneuver and drive, so I can learn those signals for myself. You see, I could get a job at a shopping mall, okay, at a clothing store, so I can watch customers as they come in, give each other verbal commands on how to pester targets. Okay, I could get a job at a big box retail store like Walmart or Best Buy or Target. Okay, the pay is going to be a little over minimum wage, right? It's still a living. It's an honest living. It's a tax-paying living. All right. Kudos to the Cuban Americans here that work, but a lot of you persons who are here that are of Cuban descent, you're taking jobs in big retail establishments so you can have access to gang stalking signaling mechanism in higher levels than ever before. Okay, because retail stores are a gigantic hub of gang stalking activity. Any targeted person will tell you that. You go into a retail store, you are going to get immediately jumped upon by 10 or 15 stalkers signaling each other to try and hurry up your visit. Now, it's not just here in South Florida. This is not just something Cubanos are doing. I could go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama right now and go into a Best Buy, and I would get jumped on by 10 or 15 stalkers who are not of Hispanic descent right away. And they're signaling each other, and they're using verbal commands and gestures while they do it. That's why some people take jobs in big retail stores. You have a lot of access to the observation of signaling mechanisms that gang stalkers do, ladies and gentlemen. All right. We're going to scroll down a little bit more. All right, here's one. We're going to look at Nicaragua. Okay, in July 1979, internal and external factors converged to bringing about the triumph of anti-Somoza insurrection and the subsequent domination of the new Nicaraguan government by the Cuban-trained leadership of the Sandinista National Liberation Front. These events provided a key test for Cuba's new mechanisms and strategies for promoting armed pro-Cuban movements in this hemisphere. Opposition to Somoza's authoritarian rule in the 1970s was widespread. The 1978 killing of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, publisher of Nicaragua's most respected newspaper, La Prensa, converted many Nicaraguans to the armed opposition, of which the FSLN was the core. The FSLN assurances on democracy and pluralism were accepted by the newly allied political moderates and private businessmen. Internationally, sympathy for the struggle against Somoza led Venezuela, Panama, and Costa Rica to aid the insurgents, while Somoza stood practically without friends. This environment enabled Cuba to disguise the extent of its support for the FSLN and avoid disrupting the fragile alliances between the FSLN and other opponents of Somoza. But behind the scenes, Cuba played an active role in organizing the FSLN and training it and equipping it militarily. Cuba had provided some training and arms to the FSLN in the early 1960s. Until late 1977, however, Cuban support consisted mainly of propaganda and safe haven. In 77 and 78, a high-ranking American department official, Armando Ulysses Estrada, made strategy to improve our internal military situation by engaging in a negotiating maneuver to gain time to regroup. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm reading here is indicative of a typical run-of-the-mill 1970s era CIA activity in South America. Okay, it was obvious from the first few paragraphs, ladies and gentlemen. It was obvious that this was CIA puppet regime Okay, what do we call it? Ventriloquist actions. Right. This is so obvious. Give me 1 second. I need to get some water, please. All right, so this is obviously CIA armed insurgencies, okay? During the 1960s, 70s, and to a lesser degree in the 80s, the American CIA used to go into the Middle East. It used to go into North Africa. It used to go into South America and set up regimes, okay, using American dollars. And it would basically control these countries from the outside using these puppet regimes. Okay, and that was some of what Che Guevara and Fidel Castro fought against in Cuba. I don't know if they knew that the regime was backed by the CIA, but yeah, the CIA backed the Batista regime and kept it running, just like the CIA was behind the it was an Iranian regime in the 1970s. I can't quite recall who the head of state was right off the bat, but the United States, the CIA has propped up dummy regimes, or what they call puppet regimes, in many countries. Many countries. And it has created a hatred of the United States in many countries. Okay, it drew a title called U.S. imperialism or U.S. meddling, or U.S. Regime building, and U.S. regime puppetry is what they called it. This is obviously what's happening here in Nicaragua. But what's happening here is Cuba has decided to use a divide and conquer strategy on the side of the FSLN. Okay, there were a lot of political dissidents in Nicaragua in these times, and unfortunately there were some political assassinations that took place. All right, there wasn't much freedom of speech in Nicaragua in the 1970s. There wasn't much freedom of speech anywhere in the Spanish-speaking world in the 1970s. Okay, every country was just about a dictatorship. Okay. I mean, what you're going to see throughout this this article is you're going to see increased interactions between Cuba and the rest of the Latin world. It says here in the I think this is still Nicaragua. It says Cuba provided few weapons and ammunition to Salvadorian guerrillas from its own resources, but played a key role in coordinating the acquisition and delivery from arms from Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Eastern Europe through Nicaragua. After the unmasking of this network, Cuba and Nicaragua reduced the flow in March and in early April. So, I mean, we've touched on this. Arms dealing, okay, cocaine dealing, probably some human slavery going on there, some child prostitution going on there in Cuba and in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. And you know what? I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen. Child prostitution is going to be sort of the X factor in all this. Okay? It's an inconvenient truth, ladies and gentlemen, that people of means throughout the entire world flock to South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands for cheap and easy access to prostitutes. Okay? Some of those prostitutes are children. Okay? You got guys flying into South America and the Caribbean islands they got a stack full of cash in their bag, right? Several thousands of dollars worth of cash stacked up in the bills in their duffel bag. And they're headed to South America and they're headed to the Caribbean islands with that cash. They're looking for two things. They're looking for drugs and they're looking for prostitutes. Okay, a weekend out with the fellas is what they call it. All right, now, something was touched on here in a very subtle way that reminds me of that epidemic that we have seen. There are countries in Southeast Asia that have struggled with that. There are countries in South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands that have struggled with that. Okay? Anywhere in the world where prostitution is in abundance, child prostitution is in abundance as well, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? And some of these countries are no different. It isn't just about arms dealing, okay? Some of these guerrilla fighters protected child brothels. Okay, these armed insurgents were standing in front of these child brothels with M16s. It's like, yeah, okay, you're a tourist. You're here. You want to pay one of these hookers? Go ahead. Go in there. Do what you got to do, but you better pay her, and then you better get right the hell out of here. All right, that was some of what these insurgents did. They weren't just bodyguards for the Castro regime. They were bodyguards for cocaine shipments. They were bodyguards for heroin shipments. They were bodyguards for brothels. They were bodyguards for Quaalude shipments. They were bodyguards for marijuana shipments. Okay, it's just it's international narco-terrorism. That's it. These guys aren't looking to come to America on boats and blow up nothing. But they will sell 35 to 50 tons of cocaine here. And the American people will buy it up like hotcakes. Okay, $27 billion a shipment, $30 billion a shipment, $50 billion a shipment, $60 billion a shipment. They were putting it right in Miami. They were moving right past the Coast Guards. You give them $1,500 a piece, they'll let you drive a 60-ton shipment of cocaine right into the Florida Keys. And the American people bought it up. I mean, there's just simply there's no doubt about that. Like, for example, 1983, we saw a $30 billion shipment of cocaine come here. The American people bought every bit of it. Okay? So what you might say is that the Cuban government was simply exploiting a demand. Right? The Cuban government, they were exploiting what you might call black market economics. Okay, that's something that you learn if you ever take an economics course, ladies and gentlemen. You have what you call regular economics, and then you have black market economics. Regular economics is supply and demand and the highs and lows and the ins and outs of consumer behavior on the American market, okay, across a wide variety of products, goods, and services. There are black market economics too. Okay, arms dealing, prostitution, marijuana sales, the sale of prescription medication on the street, Quaalude prescriptions on the street. You had cocaine sales on the street, fentanyl. You had all kinds of designer drugs on the street. You got acid, LSD, shrooms, all kinds of hallucinogenics being sold on the street, ladies and gentlemen. And there's a demand for it. You just simply can't deny that. The Castro regime, okay, what they did was okay, I think it was buffoonish. Okay, he emptied out his prisons and sent them all here. That was a buffoonish thing for him to do, right? But hey, who can blame him if the United States actually took him in and said, "Come right on in, y'all." Okay, some people say, okay, so you got Fidel Castro shipping 35 tons of cocaine into the United States in a 1-year period. Okay, 27 to 40 billion dollars of cocaine coming from Cuba to here. Okay. What can you do? Nobody was prosecuting Fidel Castro for this. The United Nations didn't step in. None of America's allies jumped in and said, hey, you know what? We don't like what Castro's doing. We're getting ready to put a battleship in the Pacific Ocean that's going to intercept all cocaine shipments from Cuba to the U.S. They didn't do that. The U.S. didn't say, you know what, we're going to put a naval destroyer in the Pacific Ocean near the coast. And we're going to intercept every boat, every ship, and every yacht that comes here from Cuba to ensure that no one's shipping dope here. They didn't do that either. So Fidel Castro looked at that wild blue yonder called the Pacific Ocean. Or the Atlantic Ocean. And he said, you know what? These are uncharted territories. All right, Fidel Castro was an astute businessman, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, he looked at that wild blue yonder that separates Cuba from the United States, and he said, you know what? We're getting ready to turn the Miami-Dade County into a cocaine den. One second, ladies and gentlemen. I have to make an adjustment. My battery is getting low. Ladies and gentlemen. I may have to divide this lecture up into 2 parts, but we'll continue the discussion. I might be able to finish the lecture before the battery goes all the way out. But Fidel Castro looked at the wild blue yonder and said, you know what, we're going to turn Miami-Dade County into a cocaine paradise. And a lot of that money is going to come back to me and my co-conspirators in the Cuban federal government. And at the time, I guess the United States just simply wasn't ready or willing to try and combat the threat. And they just dropped their hands and said, well, go on ahead and bring it on in, Castro. All 31 tons of it. And Fidel Castro said, say no more. Fidel Castro looked at that wild blue yonder and said, Cuba is about to boldly go where no man has gone before. We are going to make $27 billion off this deal. And the American people were just standing around like, all right, let's see what you got, Castro. Send it on in. We'll sample it, and if it's what you say it is, we'll start buying it at the price of $2,000 an ounce. All right, you had guys selling this stuff at $5,000 and $6,000 worth of the stuff a day. And they were becoming rich to the point where these dealers, some of them didn't have any they didn't speak a lick of English. They were starting businesses here in the United States as fronts for the cocaine trafficking. Okay? And they were building businesses and starting families. Some of them were even taking their families to church on Sunday. Some of these cocaine dealers, they were taking their families to church on Sunday. And they were paying a 10% tithe to a priest off of the cocaine money that they were making. All right. I think what I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to have to divide this up into two parts because I have limited battery life at the present time. So what I'm going to do is we're going to continue on with the lecture. I might have maybe 30 minutes of battery life left. So we're going to continue on with the lecture. We still have a number of countries to cover. We have to cover Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, Jamaica, Guyana, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, and we got Argentina, Uruguay, and then we have the postscript. So we're going to divide this lecture up into two parts. We're going to make this Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection Part 10. We're going to call this Part A. And tomorrow we're going to do Part B. So what we'll do is we'll read the first paragraph of Guatemala, and then we'll stop there, and we'll pick it back up tomorrow. Castro has stepped up Cuba's support to Guatemalan guerrillas who he has aided with arms and training since he came to power. As elsewhere, Cuba has influenced divided extremist groups to unite and has conditioned increased Cuban aid on a commitment to armed struggle and a unified strategy. During 1980, discussions about unity agreements were held among leaders of the guerrilla army of the poor, the rebel armed forces, the organization of people of the faction of the Guatemalan Communist Party, and at the invitation of Sandinista leaders, representatives of the four groups met in Managua under strict security to continue discussions. In November 1980, the four organizations signed a unity agreement in Managua to establish the National Revolutionary Union with Manuel Pinero Losada, chief of the American Department, and Ramiro Jesus Abroy Quintana, head of its Central American Division, represented Fidel Castro at the signing ceremony. Following the signing of the unity agreement, representatives of the CGR traveled to Havana to present the documents to Castro. So, I mean, what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is we see extensive Cuban involvement with guerrilla narco-terrorist organizations throughout the Latino world. Okay, I'm talking not every country, but just about every country had Cuban influence in it. And you might ask yourself, well, how did Cuba get to the point where it could go into other countries and essentially manipulate their economies and the sociological constructs of these countries through narco-terrorism? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand Cuba was moving billions of dollars in cocaine worldwide at the time. Okay, there's a lot of political maneuvering you can do when you're collecting taxpayer money and cocaine money. And I'm not talking nickel and dimes, we're talking shipments of 30 tons or more, ladies and gentlemen. All right, we are talking tens of billions of dollars. That gives the Cuban government a lot of playing around money if it wants to wreak havoc or if it wants to accumulate power in other countries throughout the Spanish-speaking world. We're going to end the lecture there, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to pick it up tomorrow. Thank you for listening.